"Sit down, old man. You're not on a battlefield, you're in a courtroom. And that cane, that's a prop for sympathy. I've seen it 100 times." The young prosecutor smirked, adjusting his tie, looking at the jury for approval. 76-year-old Walter Hayes lowered himself onto the witness chair, his right hand trembling against the silver handle of the cane he had carried for 31 years. He did not respond. He did not flinch. He simply looked at the prosecutor with eyes that had seen things that boy in the expensive suit could never imagine. The judge, a man with silver at his temples and decades on the federal bench, leaned forward slightly. Something about the cane had caught his attention. If you believe a man's quiet dignity is worth defending, type the word honor in the comments before this story unfolds. Walter Hayes lived alone in a small white house on Cedar Street, 3 blocks from the train tracks that ran through the south end of Beaufort, South Carolina. His wife, Margaret, had passed 11 years ago in the spring on a Tuesday afternoon while he was reading the newspaper in the kitchen. He still set out 2 coffee cups every morning out of habit. The second one stayed empty until he washed it again at sundown. His son, David, lived in Oregon now, a forestry engineer with 2 grown daughters of his own, and they spoke on the phone every other Sunday for exactly 42 minutes. Walter never asked for more. He moved slowly these days, the way a man moves when his body has paid the bill for things his mind would rather forget. The limp in his right leg was not from age. It was from a piece of shrapnel that had stayed lodged beside his femur since the spring of 1968, a small fragment of metal the surgeons in Da Nang had decided was safer to leave alone than to dig out. It had travelled with him for 58 years. He had stopped noticing it the way a man stops noticing the sound of a clock in his own house. The cane, however, was newer. He had carried it for 31 years now, ever since the second surgery on his hip. It was heavy, dark walnut with a polished silver handle worn smooth by his palm. Most people who saw it assumed it was a hardware store cane, the kind a son buys his father from a pharmacy. Most people were wrong. He kept the cane standing by the front door beside his late wife's umbrella. He kept his old field jacket folded in a cedar chest in the bedroom, beneath a stack of Margaret's quilts. He kept the small velvet box with the medal in a drawer he opened maybe twice a year, once on Memorial Day and once on the anniversary of the day he had earned it. He had never worn the ribbon to a parade. He had never told the story to a stranger. Even his own son had only heard pieces of it, fragments offered late at night when David was a boy, and a thunderstorm had brought certain sounds back to the surface. But what Walter Hayes did not yet know, sitting in the cab of his pickup truck that crisp October morning, with a subpoena folded in his shirt pocket, was that in 8 days, a federal judge with silver at his temples was going to stand up in his own courtroom in his black robes and bow his head to him. The Beaufort County Courthouse sat on Bay Street, a 4-story brick building with white columns and the kind of marble steps that had been worn into shallow dishes by 140 years of nervous footsteps. Walter Hayes climbed those steps slowly that Tuesday morning, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the stone, his free hand running along the cold iron railing. He wore the dark grey suit he had bought in 1989 for his daughter-in-law's mother's funeral. The jacket was a little loose in the shoulders now. The tie was the same dark blue tie he wore to every formal occasion that required one, knotted in a Windsor he had learned to tie at 17 on a Marine Corps recruit depot floor in Paris Island. His shoes were polished, his shirt was pressed. He looked like a man who had taken the morning seriously. He had been called to testify in the case of the state of South Carolina versus Marcus Allen Pritchett, a 23-year-old who had walked into the stop-and-go on Ribault Road 2 months earlier with a stolen handgun and demanded the contents of the register. Walter had been in line behind Pritchett, holding a quart of milk and a copy of the Beaufort Gazette. He had watched the young man pull the pistol. He had watched him scream at the cashier, a woman named Ellen Carver who had 2 children at home and a third on the way. He had watched her hands shake as she tried to open the drawer, and then he had done what he did. He had spoken quietly. He had stepped forward. He had placed himself between Marcus Pritchett and Ellen Carver, and he had said 3 words that the cashier would later repeat to the responding officers 9 times, because she could not believe the calmness in the old man's voice. "Son, put it down." Pritchett had not put it down. Pritchett had panicked and run, and dropped the pistol 3 blocks away in a storm drain and been arrested 4 hours later at a cousin's apartment in Port Royal. The cashier had not been hurt. Walter had walked home with his milk. The state's case rested on Walter's identification of the suspect, and on his willingness to come into a courtroom and say, under oath that the young man at the defense table was the same young man who had pointed a stolen .38 at a pregnant cashier on the 3rd of August. The defense attorney had filed a motion to strike Walter as a witness on the grounds that he was elderly, that his eyesight was suspect, and that his testimony would be unreliable. The motion had been denied. But the prosecution had been assigned to a new assistant district attorney 3 weeks before trial, a man named Bradley Whitcomb, who was 32 years old, 2 years out of Duke law, and known around the courthouse for a kind of polished cruelty that he mistook for confidence. And Bradley Whitcomb had decided, without ever meeting Walter Hayes, that he did not want this old man on his witness stand. He wanted the cashier, who was articulate and sympathetic. The old man with the cane was, in his judgment, a liability, a prop, a risk. Whitcomb had not bothered to read Walter's full intake file. If he had, he might have noticed the line that the intake clerk had typed in small letters under veteran status. If he had read it, the rest of his afternoon would have gone very differently. The courtroom smelled the way courtrooms smell. Old varnish, floor wax, the faint trace of nervous coffee breath from people who had been waiting in the hallway for 3 hours. Walter took a seat on the wooden bench in the gallery, behind the prosecution table, and he set his cane between his knees and folded his hands over the silver handle. He watched the bailiff swear in the jury. He watched the defense attorney, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Cynthia Royer, set out her files and confer briefly with her client. He watched the assistant district attorney, Bradley Whitcomb, stride into the well of the court like a man who had practiced striding. Whitcomb wore a navy suit that had been tailored to him. His shoes clicked on the parquet. He did not look back at the gallery. He did not look at Walter at all. The presiding judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to its feet. Walter rose with some effort, leaning hard on the cane. The judge was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with a close-cropped silver beard and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that he kept low on his nose. His name was Judge Theodore Calloway. He had served on the federal bench for 19 years, had been appointed by a Republican president and reaffirmed by a Democratic Senate, and was known in the Low Country as a man who ran a quiet courtroom and tolerated no theatre. He nodded to the jury, took his seat, and asked Mr. Whitcomb if the prosecution was ready to call its first witness. "The state calls Walter T. Hayes," Whitcomb said, and a small smile pulled at the corner of his mouth that no one in the jury box noticed, but that Cynthia Royer, the defense attorney, marked silently in her notebook. She had been doing this work long enough to recognize the smile of a young lawyer who had decided in advance to make a fool of someone. Walter stood. He walked the long aisle from the gallery to the witness box, his cane tapping a steady, unhurried beat on the wooden floor. Tap, step, tap, step. He felt every eye on him. He had felt eyes on him before, in places where being looked at had meant something far more dangerous, and he had learned a long time ago that the only useful response to scrutiny was to keep walking. He passed through the small swinging gate of the bar. He climbed the 2 short steps into the witness box. He raised his right hand. He swore to tell the truth. He sat down, and he placed the cane carefully between his knees the way he always did, and he looked across the courtroom at Bradley Whitcomb, and he waited. Whitcomb let the silence stretch. He glanced at the jury. He picked up a manila folder from his table. He walked slowly toward the witness box, and then he stopped, 3 feet away, and looked Walter up and down with an expression of polite theatrical doubt. "Mr. Hayes," Whitcomb said, "before we begin, would you like a moment to compose yourself? You look a little tired. I want to make sure you understand where you are." It was the first cut. It was meant to be a small one. Walter's face did not change. "I know where I am, Counselor," Walter said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime not raising it. "I am ready to answer your questions." Bradley Whitcomb smiled the smile of a man who had been waiting for that response. He turned, just slightly, so that the jury could see the angle of his profile. He paced 2 steps to his left, 2 steps back. He opened the manila folder and pretended to read from a page that he had already memorized. "Mr. Hayes, you are 76 years old, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you walk with the assistance of that cane?" "I do." "How long have you used a cane, Mr. Hayes?" 31 years. 31 years. And in that time, has your eyesight remained good? Has your memory remained sharp? Are there any medications you take that affect cognition? Any conditions we should know about?" "None that affect what I saw on August 3rd. Whitcomb nodded slowly as if humouring a child. He took another half step toward the witness box. "Mr. Hayes, You understand that the freedom of a young man's life depends on the testimony you're about to give. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand it very well." "Then I want to ask you, sir, with all due respect, to be honest with this court about what you actually saw, and what you may have imagined that you saw, on a stressful day, at your age, under fluorescent lights, in a convenience store 2 months ago." He paused. He turned to the jury. He let the words hang. "Because I am not interested, Mr. Hayes, in convicting an innocent man on the wavering memory of someone who, frankly, ought to be home in his recliner instead of leaning on a prop and pretending to be a star witness." There was a small sound from the gallery, a sharp intake of breath from a juror in the second row. Cynthia Royer at the defence table set down her pen. She did not look up. She did not have to. She knew that line had crossed something. The defendant, Marcus Pritchett, shifted in his chair. He looked, for a moment, embarrassed for the prosecutor. Even he could feel the cruelty of it. Walter Hayes did not move. His hand on the silver handle of the cane did not tremble. His breathing did not change. He simply looked at Bradley Whitcomb, and for one moment, the briefest moment, his eyes did something that Whitcomb did not have the experience to read. His eyes went somewhere very far away, and then they came back, and they fixed on the prosecutor with the kind of patient attention a man gives a thing he has decided not to fear. "Counselor," Walter said quietly, "you may ask me what you'd like." Judge Calloway on the bench was watching all of this. He had not yet said a word, but his hands, folded on the desk in front of him, had gone very still. He was a man who noticed details. He had noticed, the moment Walter walked through the gate of the bar, the way the old man carried the cane. Not the way a man carries a tool. The way a man carries something that had been given to him. And now, as Bradley Whitcomb circled the witness box like a young dog circling something, it was not yet sure how to bite. Theodore Calloway was beginning to feel, in a place very deep inside his chest, the first stir of something he had not felt in a courtroom in many years. It was anger, but it was not only anger, it was recognition. He just did not yet know of what. The questioning continued for another 12 minutes, and Bradley Whitcomb did not let up. He asked Walter 3 times to describe the lighting in the convenience store. He asked Walter twice whether the milk in his hands had obscured his view. He asked Walter with a small grin whether he had ever taken a vision test in the last decade, and whether he might be willing to submit to one now. He suggested, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the jury, that perhaps Mr. Hayes had simply seen a young man in a hoodie and assumed the worst, the way people of his generation sometimes did. He used the word generation in a way that was not quite an accusation, but that brushed close to the door of one. He let the implication hang. He did not retract it. Walter answered every question. He answered them without irritation, without elaboration, without ever raising his voice above the calm, low register he had used since he had taken the chair. He had spent his life around men who tried to provoke him. He had spent his life around men who tried, and he had learned a long time ago that the only mistake worse than losing your temper in a place like this was losing your dignity in front of someone who was hoping you would. But somewhere in the centre of his chest, in the small private room where Walter Hayes kept the things he did not show people, he was aware of a heaviness building. Not anger. Walter had stopped being angry decades ago. It was something older and quieter than anger. It was the weariness of being told again, by a man who did not know him, what he was. He had been told what he was by people who did not know him for a very long time. He had been told what he was by a recruiter in 1968. He had been told what he was by a colonel in a tent outside Quezon. He had been told what he was by a VA clerk in 1973 who lost his paperwork. He had been told what he was by a bank loan officer in 1981 who saw the word veteran on his application and decided he was a risk. He had been told what he was by his brother-in-law at his own wedding. He had been told what he was every time by people who did not bother to ask. He had stopped trying to correct them. He had learned that the truth of a man, the real truth, was not something you could shove into the ear of someone who did not want to hear it. The truth waited. The truth had its own time. His hand tightened very slightly on the silver handle of the cane. The handle was warm under his palm. It always was, after he had been holding it for a while. The silver took the heat of his hand and gave it back. The engraving was on the underside where his thumb rested. Small letters in a clean, deep script that had been etched into the metal by a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Howard Pell in 1972. Howard had done the engraving as a gift, on a quiet Saturday in a workshop on Camp Pendleton, 2 years after the action that had earned Walter the medal. Howard had used a hand tool. He had taken 3 hours to do it. He had not charged him a dime. He had said, when he handed the cane back, "You carry this, brother, and you don't ever apologize for what's on it." Walter had carried the cane for 31 years. He had never shown the engraving to anyone but his wife and his son. He did not show it now. It was Cynthia Royer who, without meaning to, set the next thing in motion. The defense attorney rose for her cross-examination, and she was brief and respectful. She asked Walter 4 questions. She thanked him. She sat down. And as she sat, she leaned slightly toward her client and murmured something. And the bailiff, on his round of the room, walked past the witness box and bumped, gently, accidentally, the foot of Walter's cane where it rested against the wooden rail. The cane slipped. It clattered with a small, sharp sound against the floor of the witness box and rolled half a turn before coming to rest against the side of the chair. The handle ended up face up, the engraved underside catching the courtroom light. Walter leaned forward to retrieve it. So did Bradley Whitcomb, who had been standing nearby and who, in a gesture that he intended as condescending courtesy, bent to pick up the cane himself. "Allow me, Mr. Hayes," Whitcomb said with a small smirk to the jury. "We wouldn't want you to strain yourself." He picked up the cane. He held it horizontally for a moment, examining it the way a man examines a thing he's about to mock. He turned it in his hands. He ran his thumb across the handle, and then, on the bench, Judge Theodore Calloway said, in a voice that was very quiet and very firm, "Mr. Whitcomb, bring that cane up here, please." The room stilled. Whitcomb looked up, surprised. "Your Honour?" "The cane, Mr. Whitcomb. I'd like to see it. Bring it to the bench." There was a beat of silence. Whitcomb's small smirk faded. He glanced at the jury, glanced at his table, and then walked slowly forward, holding the cane out in front of him like a piece of evidence he had not expected to be asked to produce. He climbed the 2 steps to the bench. He extended the cane. Judge Calloway took it from him in both hands. The judge did not speak for a moment. He turned the cane slowly. He angled the silver handle into the light from the courtroom window. He bent his head over it. He read, with his glasses slipping slightly down his nose, the small clean engraving that Howard Pell had cut into the metal in a Pendleton workshop 54 years earlier. He read it once. He read it twice. He took a slow, audible breath, and then Judge Theodore Calloway, sitting on a federal bench in the Beaufort County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in October, did something that no one in that courtroom had ever seen him do. He set the cane carefully on his desk. He removed his glasses. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. And in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but that carried, in the absolute silence of the room, all the way to the back row of the gallery, he said, "Oh, dear God." Bradley Whitcomb, standing 3 feet away, did not understand what was happening. He smiled, uncertain. He half turned to the jury. He opened his mouth. The judge raised a single hand, palm out, without looking up, and the prosecutor's mouth closed. No one in that courtroom had ever seen Theodore Calloway raise his hand to silence anyone. He did not need to. The look on his face was doing a thing the gesture only confirmed. Something had just changed in that room, and not a single person in it, except, perhaps, Walter Hayes himself, who sat very still in the witness box with his hands folded in his lap, knew yet what it was. Judge Calloway sat with the cane on his desk for what felt to the people watching him like a very long time. It was in fact 18 seconds. He took those 18 seconds, and then he lifted his head, and he looked across the courtroom at Walter Hayes, really looked at him for the first time, and his eyes were wet at the corners in a way that no one in that room had ever seen. "Mr. Hayes," he said. His voice was thicker than it had been a moment before. "Forgive me. I'm going to need to take a brief recess. Counsel, please remain in the courtroom. Mr. Hayes, would you do me the very great honour of waiting for me in my chambers?" Walter, who had been preparing himself for the next round of questions, blinked once. He looked at the judge. He saw the look on the judge's face. He did not entirely understand it, but he understood it well enough. He nodded. "Yes, Your Honour." "Thank you, sir." The judge turned. "Bailiff, please escort Mr. Hayes to my chambers and see that he is comfortable. I'd like a glass of water for him, please, and his cane." He picked it up himself, slowly, with both hands, and he held it out across the desk to the bailiff with a kind of careful reverence that made every juror in the box sit up a little straighter without quite knowing why. "Carry this to him, please. Carry it carefully." The bailiff, a deputy sheriff named Ronnie Pearson, who had worked in the courthouse for 16 years and who had also served 2 tours as a Navy corpsman in Iraq, took the cane in both hands. He looked down at the silver handle. He read what was engraved there. His face did a small thing, and then it stilled, and he tucked the cane against his chest like a man carrying a child, and he turned and walked to the witness box, and he offered Walter Hayes his arm to step down. He said, very quietly, so that only Walter could hear, "Sergeant, it's an honour." Walter looked at him. He held the deputy's eyes for a long moment. He said, "Son, I'm just here to testify." "Yes, Sergeant," Pearson said. "Yes, you are." They walked together out of the courtroom, the old man and the deputy, the bailiff carrying the cane. The door swung shut behind them. The room was silent. Judge Calloway stood. He smoothed the front of his robes. He looked at Bradley Whitcomb. His face was no longer wet. It was something else now. It was the face of a man who had decided what he was going to say, and who was going to take a great deal of pleasure in saying it, and who was going to wait until everyone in that room understood the weight of it before he began. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "before I take this recess, I'm going to need you to stand exactly where you're standing right now. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Honour," Whitcomb said. His mouth was dry. "Good. Don't move." The judge stepped down from the bench. He walked, slowly, around the well of the court. He came to a stop in front of the prosecutor, and in the silence of that room, with the jurors leaning forward in their box, and the defence attorney holding her breath, and the defendant Marcus Pritchett staring with his mouth slightly open, Judge Theodore Calloway picked up a phone on the clerk's desk, dialed 3 digits, and said, "Get Marcus Davies on the line. Tell him it's Theo Calloway. Tell him I am sitting in my courtroom in Beaufort, and I have just read the name Walter T. Hayes engraved on a cane. He'll know what that means. Tell him he needs to come here, today." Bradley Whitcomb stood very still in the well of the court. Sweat had begun to bead at his hairline. He did not understand fully what was happening, but he had practiced enough law in the federal system to recognize the shape of a disaster when one was being assembled in front of him. He had heard the name the judge had spoken into the phone, Marcus Davies. He knew that name. Every lawyer in the southeastern district knew that name. Marcus Davies was a retired 3-star general, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, a man who now lived on a farm outside Charleston, and who had testified twice before Congress about veteran care. Marcus Davies did not come to Beaufort for trials. Marcus Davies did not come to Beaufort for anything, and yet Judge Theodore Calloway had just called him personally, and had invoked the name of the 76-year-old witness Bradley Whitcomb had spent the last 40 minutes mocking, and the call had been, by every indication on the judge's end of the line, accepted. The judge hung up the phone. He turned. He did not look at Whitcomb. He walked back to the bench. He climbed the steps. He sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I am going to ask for your patience. I am declaring a recess of this proceeding for the remainder of the morning. You will be released to the jury room, where lunch will be brought to you. You are not to discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone. Court will resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Bailiff, please see the jury out." The jurors filed out, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. The door to the jury room closed. The judge turned then, and he looked at Bradley Whitcomb, and his face was the face of a man who had been measuring something for 40 minutes, and who had now finished measuring. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "please take a seat at counsel table. We are going to wait. While we wait, I am going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask you to answer it honestly, because the answer is going to determine the next 30 years of your career." Whitcomb sat down. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out his chair. "Yes, Your Honour." "Did you, at any point in your preparation for this case, read the witness intake file for Mr. Walter T. Hayes?" There was a long pause. "I read the summary, Your Honour." "Did you read the summary, Mr. Whitcomb, or did you skim the summary?" I read it sufficiently to—" "Mr. Whitcomb, the intake clerk in this office, a woman named Janet Sloan, has been doing her job for 27 years. Janet writes one line at the bottom of every veteran intake. One line. She types it in capital letters. It is the last thing on the page. Do you remember what it said on Mr. Hayes's intake?" Whitcomb opened his mouth. He closed it. He shook his head, very slightly, no. "Then I will tell you," the judge said. "Janet wrote in capital letters, Silver Star recipient, Republic of Vietnam, 1970. See commendation file. Citation attached. The judge let that sit. He let it sit a long time. Bradley Whitcomb's face had gone the colour of the parchment paper they used for the jury summons. Across the room, the defence attorney Cynthia Royer had quietly put a hand over her mouth. Marcus Pritchett, the defendant, was staring at the floor. He was 23 years old. He had robbed a convenience store at gunpoint. He had been guilty when he walked in. But even he, in that moment, felt a kind of cold, sober shame for the lawyer who had been sent to prosecute him. He thought, in his confused 23-year-old way, that the old man on the witness stand had done something a long time ago that he, Marcus Pritchett, would never in his life come close to. And he thought it was a strange and terrible thing to watch a man in a tailored suit be wrong about another man in front of a jury that wasn't even in the room. The man who walked into the chambers of Judge Theodore Calloway at 12:47 that afternoon was 78 years old and stood 6'2" in stockinged feet. He wore a dark suit and a black tie and a small lapel pin in the shape of an eagle, globe, and anchor. His hair was pure white and clipped close to his skull. His shoulders were the shoulders of a man who, even at 78, still did push-ups every morning on a mat beside his bed, because that was simply what he had done every morning of his adult life, and he had not seen any reason to stop. His name was Marcus Edward Davies. He had served 41 years in the United States Marine Corps. He had retired as Lieutenant General. He had buried in his lifetime more men than he could carry in a single thought, and he had made a kind of private peace with the fact that every one of them was still with him, in a way that the living would never quite understand. He had driven himself to Beaufort. He had not brought an aide. He had not told his wife where he was going. She had simply seen the look on his face when he hung up the phone, and she had said, "Go," and he had gone. When he walked into the chambers and saw Walter Hayes sitting in a leather chair by the window with a cane resting across his knees, the general stopped in the doorway. He did not speak. He did not move for a full 10 seconds. And then, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who had spent his entire adult life rendering courtesies in their proper order, Marcus Davies came to attention. He brought his heels together. He squared his shoulders. He raised his right hand to his temple in a sharp, perfect salute, and he held it. Walter Hayes looked up. He saw the man in the doorway. He saw the salute. He set the cane carefully against the arm of the chair. He pushed himself to his feet. He stood, with some difficulty, leaning a hand against the windowsill for balance, and he raised his own hand in a return salute that was, despite the tremor of age, still the salute of a Marine sergeant who had learned how to give one in the spring of 1967. "At ease, General," Walter said quietly. Marcus Davies dropped his hand. He took 3 long strides across the chambers. He took Walter Hayes's hand in both of his, and he held it. He did not shake it. He just held it. "Sergeant Hayes," he said. His voice was rough. "Sergeant Hayes, I've wanted to find you for 54 years." Walter looked at him. He blinked twice. Slowly the lines of his face shifted in a way they did not often shift. He had not expected this. He had not, when he had walked up the marble steps of the courthouse that morning with a subpoena folded in his shirt pocket, expected, ever, to be in a small wood-panelled room in the back of a federal courthouse, with a man in a black suit holding his hand and saying these particular words. "Son," Walter said very softly, "I don't know that You don't know me, Sergeant. You wouldn't. I was 19 years old. I was a private first class. I was the radio operator on the 3rd Squad, and you carried me 800 metres through a rice paddy on the morning of the 4th of February 1970, with 2 rounds in your right thigh and a piece of an RPG in your hip, because the medic had been killed an hour earlier and there was no one else who was going to do it. I weighed 176 pounds. You did not stop. You did not put me down. You walked me to the LZ. You handed me to the door gunner, and you turned around and you went back. And you did it 3 more times, with 3 more men, and one of them was Lieutenant Wexler, and one of them was Corporal Bowman, and the last one, the very last one, was a man whose name was on a small piece of paper in your own pocket, because his wife had asked you to mail it to her if anything happened to him, and you mailed it. 3 weeks later, from the hospital. I read about it in a letter she wrote to my mother in 1973. Walter Hayes looked at the general. He did not speak. His eyes had gone somewhere very far away, and this time they did not come back quickly. "My mother," Marcus Davies said, was a woman named Eleanor Davies. She was a nurse. She volunteered at the VFW post in Charleston for 40 years. The wife of Corporal Bowman, her name was Patricia Bowman. Patricia Bowman moved to Charleston in 1972 with 2 small children because her husband's parents had a house on Sullivan's Island and she had nowhere else to go. My mother took her in. My mother helped raise those children. And Patricia Bowman, Sergeant, told my mother every single Christmas until she died in 2004. The story of the man who had carried her husband out of that paddy and held his hand while he died on the deck of a Huey, and who had stopped on the deck of that Huey as the helicopter was lifting off to take a piece of paper out of her husband's pocket and put it in his own, because her husband had asked him to. The General's voice had gone very thick. He cleared his throat twice. He went on. That paper, Sergeant. That paper had a poem on it, a poem her husband had written for her on R&R 6 months earlier. You mailed it to her in 1970 from a hospital in Yokosuka, with a letter you wrote yourself on hospital stationery, 3 lines long. Patricia Bowman kept that letter in a frame on her wall for 34 years. She showed it to me when I was a captain. She showed it to me when I was a colonel. She showed it to me when I was promoted to brigadier general. She said to me, every single time, the same thing. She said, "You find that man, Marcus. You find him, and you tell him I am still here because of him. You find him, and you tell him my children are still here because of him. You find him." And I tried. Sergeant. I tried for 30 years. I had aides comb the personnel records. The records had been damaged in the 73 fire at the National Personnel Records Centre. We never had a current address. We had a name, Walter T. Hayes, and we had a citation, and we had a date. And every 5 years I would tell my aide to try again, and every 5 years my aide would come back and shake his head, and I would think, perhaps you are not meant to find him. Perhaps he does not want to be found. Perhaps it is enough that what he did is known by the people whose lives are still being lived because of it. The General paused. He took a long breath. He looked at Walter Hayes and his eyes were wet and he did not bother to hide it. And then, Sergeant, this morning, at 12:16 in the afternoon, my old friend Theo Calloway called me on a courtroom phone, and he said, "I have just read the name Walter T. Hayes engraved on a cane," and I knew. I knew before he finished the sentence. I knew because Patricia Bowman had told me, once, that you had told her, in the letter, that you had a piece of metal in your hip, and you would walk with a cane the rest of your life. And I knew, in that moment, that 54 years of looking had ended on a Tuesday in October, in a courthouse in Beaufort, South Carolina, because a young prosecutor had decided to make fun of an old man's cane. Walter Hayes had not moved. He was still standing by the window. His hand was still on the sill. His face was very still. And then, slowly, almost without his permission, a single tear travelled the long weathered slope of his right cheek, and he did not move to wipe it away. "General," he said very quietly, "Patricia is—" "She passed in '04, Sergeant. Cancer. She went peacefully. The children are grown. They are 48 and 46. They have children of their own. They know who you are, Sergeant. They have always known who you are. They will want to meet you." Walter Hayes closed his eyes. And what no one in that chambers could yet see, what would only become clear in the next 48 hours, when Judge Theodore Calloway picked up his phone and made 23 calls to 23 people he had known across his 19 years on the federal bench, was that Walter Hayes was about to spend the rest of his life being known. At 1:28 that afternoon, Judge Theodore Calloway returned to the bench. The jury was reseated. The gallery had filled. Word had travelled, in the quiet way word travels in a courthouse, and there were now reporters in the back row. Bradley Whitcomb was sitting at the prosecution table, with his hands folded in his lap and his face the colour of bone. He had spent the recess sitting alone in his office. He had read finally the witness intake file. He had read the citation that had been attached. He had read the words with complete disregard for his own safety and extracted 4 wounded Marines under sustained enemy fire, and his actions saved the lives of his entire squad. He had read the date. He had read the place. He had set the file down on his desk, and he had put his face in his hands, and he had sat that way for a very long time. The judge took his seat. He cleared his throat. He looked at the jury, and he said, in the calm voice that he was famous for using when he was about to say something that would matter, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before we resume testimony, I am going to put something on the record. I am going to put it on the record because I think it is important that it is on the record, and because I think the people in this courtroom, including, perhaps especially the lawyers in this courtroom, need to hear it said out loud. He paused. He looked at Bradley Whitcomb. He looked for a long moment at Walter Hayes, who had returned to the witness box and who had set his cane carefully between his knees and who was sitting with the same quiet patience he had sat with that morning. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, "I owe you an apology. On behalf of this court, on behalf of the state of South Carolina, and on behalf of every person in this room who allowed the morning's proceedings to unfold without standing up and putting a stop to them, including myself, I owe you an apology, and I am going to give it to you now, sir, on the record, in front of the jury and the press and God and anyone else who is listening." And then Judge Theodore Calloway, 62 years old, 19 years on the federal bench, did a thing that no one in that courtroom had ever seen a sitting federal judge do. He stood up. He stood up in his black robes behind his bench, and he bowed his head. He bowed it to Walter T. Hayes in the witness box, and he held it bowed for what would later be described by every reporter present as a full 5 seconds, and then he raised it, and he spoke, and his voice was steady, and it carried. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "of the United States Marine Corps, recipient of the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in the Republic of Vietnam on the 4th of February 1970, father, husband, citizen of this town for 41 years, I am sorry, sir. I am sorry that you have had to sit in my courtroom this morning and be spoken to in the manner that you were spoken to. I am sorry that I did not stop it sooner, and I am sorry that you have spent the last 54 years walking through this country with that medal in a drawer and that engraving under your thumb, while the rest of us, in our suits and our offices and our comfortable assumptions, have failed to notice the kind of man who was walking past us. I am sorry, Sergeant. I am sorry on behalf of all of us." The room was silent. Walter Hayes looked at the judge. He nodded very slightly. He did not speak. He did not need to. Bradley Whitcomb rose. He had not been called upon. He rose anyway. His hands were shaking. He was not a brave man, but he was not, in the deepest place inside himself, a stupid one either, and he had spent the last hour and a half understanding, with a slow and terrible clarity, exactly what he had done. He cleared his throat. He looked at the judge. He looked at Walter Hayes. "Your Honour, may I be permitted to address the witness?" "You may, Mr. Whitcomb." The young prosecutor walked slowly to the witness box. He did not pace. He did not turn to the jury. He stood in front of Walter Hayes 3 feet away, where he had stood that morning when he had said the words "prop for sympathy," and felt in that moment very pleased with himself. He stood there now, and he looked Walter Hayes in the face, and the muscle in his jaw worked once before he could speak. "Mr. Hayes, Sergeant Hayes, I do not know what to say to you that will undo what I said to you this morning. I do not know that anything will undo it. I want you to know, sir, that I read your file during the recess. I read what you did. I read the names of the men you carried. I read the date, and I want you to know, Mr. Hayes, that I am ashamed of myself, sir. I am ashamed in a way that I have not been ashamed of myself in my adult life, and I am sorry. I am sorry, sir. I do not deserve your forgiveness. I am not asking for it. I am only asking, sir, that you allow me to say it to you, on the record, the way you allowed me to say what I said to you this morning. I am sorry, Mr. Hayes." Walter Hayes looked at the young man. He looked at him for a long moment. The young man's face was wet now. His tie was crooked. His hands were trembling. And Walter Hayes, who had spent his life refusing to give what the world had not earned from him, looked at this 32-year-old prosecutor and saw for the first time not a smug young man in a tailored suit, but a boy who had made a mistake in front of a great many people, and who was now learning in real time what kind of man he was going to choose to be in the next 5 seconds. Walter said quietly, "Counselor, lean a little closer." Bradley Whitcomb leaned in. The microphone in the witness box did not pick up what Walter said next. The court reporter could not transcribe it. Only Bradley Whitcomb heard it, and only Bradley Whitcomb would ever know what the old man had said to him in that moment. But every person in that courtroom watched the young prosecutor's face, and every person in that courtroom saw what happened to it. They saw his eyes close. They saw his shoulders drop. They saw a single tear fall from the corner of his right eye and land on the wooden rail of the witness box. They saw him nod once, very slowly, and they saw him whisper the words, "Yes, sir, thank you, sir," and step back. He returned to his table. He sat down. He did not look up for a long time. and what no one in that courtroom yet knew was that Bradley Whitcomb would, within the year, leave the district attorney's office and accept an unpaid position with the South Carolina Veterans Legal Aid Project, where he would work for the next 11 years on disability appeals for elderly veterans, and where he would carry in the inside pocket of his suit jacket, every single day, a small folded card on which he had written in his own hand the 7 words that Walter T. Hayes had said to him in the witness box on a Tuesday in October. The trial of Marcus Allen Pritchett resumed at 3:15 that afternoon. Walter Hayes finished his testimony. He answered 6 more questions calmly and clearly, and he identified the defendant, and he stepped down from the witness box, and the bailiff Ronnie Pearson walked him to the back of the courtroom and held the door for him. Pritchett was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced 6 weeks later to 9 years in the Department of Corrections. He served 7. And his first letter from prison, written 11 months in, was addressed to a Mr. Walter T. Hayes, care of the Beaufort County Veterans Council. And it began with the words, "Sir, I want you to know I've been thinking about what you did the day you said, 'Son, put it down,' and what it meant that you said the word 'son' to a man who was pointing a gun at you, and I want you to know that I have been thinking about it every day since I came in here," Walter wrote back. He wrote back to every letter Marcus Pritchett sent him for 7 years. He never mentioned in any of those letters the medal or the cane or the courtroom. He only wrote in his careful hand about ordinary things: weather, the garden behind his house, the book he was reading that month, a grandchild's birthday. He signed every letter the same way: Walter. The story of what had happened in Judge Theodore Calloway's courtroom on the 3rd Tuesday of October did not make the front page of any newspaper, but it made the local news, and it made a column in the Charleston Post and Courier, and a reporter from the Marine Corps Times drove down 2 weeks later and sat with Walter Hayes on the porch of the small white house on Cedar Street, and listened to him talk for 2 hours, mostly about Margaret and about David, and about the garden, and only briefly at the very end about the 4th of February 1970. The article ran in the December issue. The Marine Corps Commandant read it on a flight from Quantico to San Diego, and he set the magazine down on the tray table, and he sat looking out the window for a long time, and when he landed he made a phone call. In the spring of the following year, on a Saturday afternoon in the gymnasium of the Beaufort High School, with 340 people in folding chairs and a Marine colour guard at attention along the wall, Walter T. Hayes was awarded the Marine Corps Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony that had been quietly arranged by Lieutenant General Marcus Davies and Judge Theodore Calloway, and a small group of other men whose names Walter did not know. His son David flew in from Oregon with both of his daughters. Patricia Bowman's 2 children, now in their late 40s, drove down from Charleston, and they brought their own children, and they sat in the front row, and they wept openly when the citation was read, and afterward they came forward, and they embraced Walter Hayes, and the youngest of Patricia Bowman's grandchildren, a boy of 7 named Walter Bowman because his grandmother had insisted on it before she died, walked up to the old man with the cane, and he said, very seriously, "Sir, I am named after you." And Walter Hayes knelt down slowly, painfully, and he took the boy's hand in both of his, and he said, "Then you have a great deal to live up to, son, and I think you will." Walter Hayes lived another 4 years after that ceremony. He died peacefully in his sleep in the small white house on Cedar Street on a Wednesday morning in March, with his cane standing beside the bed and a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen table. His son David was on a plane within 3 hours. The funeral was held at the Beaufort National Cemetery on a clear, cold Saturday. 300 Marines were there. Lieutenant General Marcus Davies delivered the eulogy. Judge Theodore Calloway sat in the second row in a black suit, and he wept without trying to hide it. Bradley Whitcomb sat 3 rows back with his wife, and he held in his hand a small folded card that he'd carried in his pocket for nearly 5 years. Marcus Pritchett, by then a free man working as a welder upstate, sent a letter and a single white rose by courier, and the rose was placed on the casket by the funeral director with the others, and no one but Walter's son David knew where it had come from. The cane went to David. The medal went to the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, where it sits today in a glass case beside a small black and white photograph of Sergeant Walter T. Hayes, Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, taken in March of 1970 on the deck of a Navy hospital ship, where he is sitting in a wheelchair with a bandage around his right thigh and a faint, exhausted smile on his face, and where, beneath the photograph, on a small brass plate, are inscribed the 7 words that Walter Hayes once whispered to a young prosecutor in a witness box in Beaufort, South Carolina, on a Tuesday in October. The plate reads, "It is never too late to choose." There are men walking among us right now, in wrinkled suits and worn coats, with canes in their hands and quiet eyes, who have done things in their lives that the people passing them on the sidewalk cannot imagine and would not believe. They do not ask to be recognized. They do not ask to be thanked. They only ask, when they ask anything at all, to be seen as men. And the quiet truth that Walter Hayes carried for 54 years, beneath his thumb on the silver handle of a cane he never showed to a stranger, is the truth that every one of us is asked sooner or later to recognize. That the worth of a person is almost never written on the outside, and that the hand you fail to take, the eye you fail to meet, the man you fail to see, may be carrying in silence a weight you would not have the strength to lift for a single afternoon. If this story moved you, if Walter Hayes' quiet dignity reminds you of someone you know, or someone you should have honoured while you still could, do one thing tonight. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with one person who needs to hear it, and in the comments below, leave the name of a veteran in your life, alive or gone, whose worth was not measured by the world the way it should have been. We will read every name, every single one.